You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Thursday, January 17th, 2019. It is also the feast day of St. Anthony of Padua, or as he is known in Portugal, his home country, St. Anthony of Lisbon. St. Anthony is a wonderful saint. He was a Franciscan who lived many years ago, born in Portugal, lived most of his ministry out in Italy. But he is also the intercessor of lost things. So if you've ever lost things and said the prayer, St. Anthony, please come around. Something is lost that cannot be found without your help. Then you have used the intercession of St. Anthony. But he was a profound example of the virtue that we are talking about this week, the virtue of faith. And he, like so many other saints that came before him, that came after him, that still live today, they are all examples of how faith, once we have really drawn near to God and received this virtue, how the virtue of faith can transform our lives utterly. So today we're not only going to talk about St. Anthony of Lisbon or Padua, wherever you want to say he was from. We're going to talk about several other saints. We're going to talk about how they came to the virtue of faith, or how God chose a situation to bestow this virtue on them, but also how their life was transformed. So let's start with one saint way in the beginning. Let's start with St. Matthew. So St. Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, but as you might know, he was a tax collector. Now, tax collectors were seen as sinners. They were despised in the time of Jesus, and oftentimes they were greedy and totally corrupt. St. Matthew was in the work of collecting taxes when Jesus called him. And although we don't get to crawl inside the mind of St. Matthew, we do get to see what he did. He immediately stood up, left behind his tax collecting post, and followed Jesus. In some gospel accounts, we're told that he says he will make right any wrongs he did while collecting taxes, and we know that he was one of Jesus's closest followers. So St. Matthew's moment where he received the virtue of faith, it was a solitary moment. Jesus came to him personally, called him by name, and he was transformed in that moment. So that's one example, and that still happens today. Sometimes people can be at a retreat or even quietly praying after receiving the Eucharist, and Jesus can come to them in a personal way and transform their life in a moment. The next saint we're going to look at is a saint from a long time ago, but he lived in the early church. Not quite so early, but kind of early, and that is St. Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo. Now, St. Augustine is a very interesting character, but a quick biography of him is that he was a little bit of a rascal. He lived a sinful life. He did all sorts of things he shouldn't have done, and yet he constantly was seeking for the truth. He looked for it in some wrong places at first, but he was constantly seeking. He was a thinker and a studier, and he also had a mother that prayed for him diligently. So after years and years of seeking and thinking and going down the wrong path, after all of those years, he finally stumbled upon the truth. And he studied that truth, he examined the truth of Jesus Christ, and after more time, he embraced it. He continued to study even after embracing it and grew deeper and deeper into the virtue of faith. So now he did not have a single moment where God appeared to him and gave him this virtue. It was something he grew into and something that blossomed out of studying and searching. Now, the final example of a saint that had a true virtue of faith is my favorite, Saint Therese. Saint Therese was very young when she died, and so her journey to faith was different. Saint Therese really received the gift of faith, or she was exposed to this virtue in her family. She was raised in a very devout family. In fact, all of her sisters became nuns, just like she did, and her mother, Zélie, and her father, Louis, both are saints. So, of course, so she lived in a very devout family. She trusted that the faith of her parents and the faith of her sisters was truth. She internalized that. She grew in prayer and experienced that truth through a personal relationship with God. And that is how she came to faith. And so, Sprouts, I tell you these stories of these saints, not just to have good stories, but to inspire you to seek out your own journey to the virtue of faith. We know, of course, that God alone can give us this virtue, that we have to be searching for Him, or at least responding to Him when He calls in order to get this beautiful virtue. And so, my friends, I want you to think through the saints we talked about today. St. Anthony, St. Matthew, St. Augustine, and St. Therese. Think about those saints and examine which one feels like probably they were more similar to you than the others. I want you to use that saint as a special intercessor today and ask them to help you in your own journey of faith. Simply say, St. Therese, help me to have a beautiful journey of faith just like you did.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. And finally, a quick note to the grown-ups. First of all, thank you for listening to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. I ask that you please consider sharing this podcast with another Catholic family you know. Send them an email, a text, or simply mention it the next time you see them. Please join me in the mission of helping each Catholic child truly sprout into the wonderful human that God created them to be.